This meeting is being recorded.
All right, so I want to welcome you all to this continuation of the Beethoven Zoom course I taught earlier. I think most of you were in on that. If you were not and you wanted to see some of those classes, you can get in touch with me and I can send you recordings. But when I got to the last class, I unfortunately sort of had to rush through his last period in order to sort of kill him off, which I didn't feel good about because so many great things he wrote in the last part. Let's see. Somebody says that it's poor fidelity. I should be directly going into my wireless. Hopefully it's okay. But maybe it'll get better. And the other issue is that his last pieces of several 5 or 6 piano sonatas are really difficult, and they were not pieces that I had fully in my repertoire. They're also not pieces that are easy to read, and that's what makes them very difficult. They look strange on the score, and I'll show you that to some people. I also wanted to say that besides being Beethoven's birthday, I do this class in honor of my father, who sadly passed away 3 years ago, a couple days ago. Here he is. There's my dad. And all of his art is up here on the wall. One of the sad things about this pandemic, I'm glad he didn't have to live through it, but I wish he had been able to see some of my performances virtually, which my mom has been able to do in Buffalo. So I really do miss the fact. But I have his yellow period behind me, some of his flowers. And like Beethoven, he had a lot of worry about mankind, but a lot of faith in mankind. And I think we're going through a difficult period. I think there's hope on the horizon with some new leadership and the vaccine. And I think Beethoven's music that I'm going to play today and on Friday will give us that sense of horror about mankind at times, but also this abiding faith that God and humankind can merge together in some way to bring us into a positive realm. So hopefully you will get some of this out of all of this majestic music that I'll be playing over the next couple days. So let me get to, I know some people saying that the quality is not as good. I don't know why, but I'm thoroughly into my Ethernet here. It should be working. I can try something at halftime if it doesn't work any better, but let's see how it goes. All right, I want to share my screen here. Hold on one sec here. I got to move this thing out of the way. All right, so we're going to really be focusing on this period from about 1808, 1809 until he dies in 1827. Here's Beethoven that is sort of most heroic, painting in 1804. And a quote from that time period, he said once, "You will ask where my ideas come from. I cannot say for certain. They come uncalled, sometimes in association with other things. It seems to me that I caress them from nature herself with my own hands as I go walking in the woods. They come to me in the silence of the night or in the early morning, stirred into being by moods which the poet would translate into words, but which I put into sounds. And these go through my head, ringing and singing and storming, until at last I have them before me as notes." All right, now, here is a portrait of Beethoven a little bit later. This is from 1815, which we will get to later, by a guy named Joseph Mahler. In that period, there was some changes that Beethoven went through. His big supporter, Prince Lichnowsky, who we met in the first several classes, who Beethoven wrote many of his early works for, including the Pathetique Sonata, they had a big falling out at some point when Beethoven refused to play at a party where some French soldiers had come to Lichnowsky's home. After that, Lichnowsky sort of took away the an annual income he was paying to Beethoven, and Beethoven began to struggle. And a lot of the last several years are kind of this prosaic struggle just to survive financially. In 1807, he petitions the Royal Imperial Court Theatre to try to get a fixed income in return for composing one opera per year, and he threatens to leave Vienna if that income doesn't come. And here's what he wrote, partly. He said, Admittedly, the undersigned may flatter himself that so far during the period of his stay in Vienna, he has won a certain amount of favor and appreciation, not only from the distinguished aristocracy, but also from the rest of the public, and that his works have been given an honorable reception both at home and abroad. Nevertheless, he has had to contend with all kinds of difficulties, and as yet he has not been fortunate enough to establish himself here in a position compatible with his desire to live entirely for art, to develop his talents to an even higher degree of perfection, which must be the aim of every true artist, and to secure for an independent future the advantages which hitherto have been merely incidental. Since on the whole the aim which he has ever pursued in his career has been much less to earn his daily bread than to raise the taste of the public and to let his genius soar to greater heights and even to perfection, the inevitable result has been that the undersigned has sacrificed to the muse both material profit and his own advantage. Nevertheless, works of this kind have won him in distant countries a reputation which in several important centers guarantees to him the most favorable reception and a future suited to his talents and his knowledge. He goes on, but he's basically sort of threatening to leave Vienna if they don't pony up some money so that he can compose and have a life. He does not actually get a response to this letter, which is interesting. And in the meantime, he composes his 5th and 6th symphonies in 1808. And he produces this massive program, which I talked about a little bit last time, on December 22nd, 1808, premiering both those pieces as well as the 4th Piano Concerto and the Choral Fantasy. It was a cold winter day, everyone freezing. The concert lasted more than 4 hours. And as one prince said, "There we sat in the most bitter cold from 6 o'clock until 10:30, and we confirmed for ourselves the maxim that one may easily have too much of a good thing and still more of a powerful one." And somebody else wrote, "To judge all these pieces after one and only one hearing, especially considering the language of Beethoven's works, in that so many were performed one after the other, most of them are so grand and long, it was downright impossible to sit through." And I just wanted to play really briefly one of my favorite moments in Beethoven, and that is the transition from the 3rd movement, this little light scherzo, into the glorious light of the last movement. You've all heard it, but this is really the essence of Beethoven's heroic period. So let me play you a little bit of this thing, if I can find it. Here it is. All right. Buckle up. It's a great moment. just a great moment that I think shows Beethoven's ability to just come out of the ether, out of the primordial mass of the ground, to one of the greatest moments in music. And he'll do the same thing in the beginning of the Ninth Symphony, as that sort of comes out of, sounds like the strings are all tuning up. And there are moments in his piano sonatas where he does this as well. Just wanted to share that great moment. All right, now I want to get back to talk a little bit about... So in October of 1808, Beethoven does get an offer from King Jerome Bonaparte of Westphalia, the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's making war all across Europe. And Bonaparte actually offers Beethoven a pretty good salary to become the Kapellmeister in Kassel. And Beethoven seriously thinks about it, and he also uses it as pretty good leverage as he wants to stay in Vienna, but he needs some money. And he enters into this agreement, ultimately, with three people, Prince Lobkowitz, Prince Kinsky, and Archduke Rudolph, who is going to become very important, the latter, in Beethoven's life, on March 1st, 1809. Here's what the agreement said. It said, "As it has been demonstrated that only one who is as free from care as possible can devote himself to a single department of activity and create works of magnitude which are exalted and which ennoble art, the undersigned have decided to place Herr Ludwig van Beethoven in a position where the necessaries of life shall not cause him embarrassment or clog his powerful genius." This is what Beethoven had been looking forward to. Finally, he sort of didn't have to grovel to get money. They were going to pay him, and it was a great deal when it was laid out. There was no requirement to write a specific amount of pieces. It was basically just be a creative genius. That's kind of good. The first time that had ever been done. And Beethoven really was quite ecstatic at this time. He writes to his friend a couple months later, you will see from the enclosed document, which he shows this, how honorable my remaining here has now become for me. Moreover, the title of Imperial Kapellmeister is sure to follow. It never did. Now let me know as soon as possible whether you think that in the present warlike conditions I ought to travel. Maybe you can help me look for a wife. Indeed, you might find some beautiful girl in Freiburg where you are at present, and one who would perhaps now and then grant a sigh to my harmonies. And we're going to talk about Beethoven constantly looking for that ideal woman, never finding her, and in the end, settling on his nephew to sort of torture, which we'll get to later in this class. Unfortunately, right after this agreement is put into place in March 1st, 1809, Napoleon invades Vienna. And it actually causes Rudolf to have to flee. Rudolf was the son of Emperor Leopold, the brother of Emperor Franz. The whole royal family has to get out. And it actually causes, ultimately, the devaluation of the Austrian currency. So that annuity, which was going to be quite a lot of money, in the end, by 1812, is only worth about 40%. And it's not enough for Beethoven to live on. So circumstances really went against Beethoven. On top of that, Lobkowitz goes bankrupt, and Kinsky dies in a riding accident. So it's only Rudolf who ends up paying, and it's not nearly enough to keep him going. Now here is the Archduke Rudolf of Austria, born in 1788. So he's about 20 years younger than Beethoven. He was the youngest son of Emperor Leopold II, and then when Leopold dies, the brother of Emperor Franz. He was a pretty good pianist, apparently. Began taking piano and composition lessons with Beethoven in 1803. And in fact, Beethoven supposedly writes his triple concerto for him to play. That's the cello, violin, piano, where the violin and cello parts are a little bit harder than the piano. It was a way to give Rudolf a chance to shine, but have some backup as well. They become quite close friends, and Rudolf is definitely one of Beethoven's strongest supporters right to the end. He was the one made that contract. It was supposed to be 4,000 florins, which was quite a lot of money. Beethoven dedicates 14 different pieces to him, including the Emperor Concerto, his fifth piano concerto, the Archduke Piano Trio, and the Hammerklavier, which I will play part of later today, and Les Adieux, which I'm going to start off with, piano sonata, that was written actually for him when he left Vienna. He would ultimately later become the Archbishop of Olomouc in 1819, for which Beethoven was supposed to write his Missa Solemnis. He doesn't finish it in time for the actual ceremony, but he does in 1823. We're going to finish with that one today. But I want to start off by playing this Les Adieux Sonata. It's number 26 in E-flat major, and it's written in 1809 and 1810. composed exactly when the French begin to occupy Vienna. Napoleon invaded. Beethoven actually has to seek shelter in the basement of his brother's house because there's bombs going on around him and muskets and cannons. And the Viennese were not prepared for this invasion. Apparently, some soldiers had to arm themselves with muskets and swords that were taken from the prop rooms of the theaters. They didn't even have enough weaponry. But on May 4th, the imperial family, including 20-year-old Rudolph, evacuates to the countryside. And we know that Beethoven begins writing this sonata that day because he writes on the title page, "Written from the heart on the occasion of the departure of Archduke Rudolph on May 4th. The second movement, known as Absence, is written while he's away and during the occupation. And then the third movement, he begins on January 30th, 1810, when the royal clan returns. And it really feels like you hear the rolling of the carriage coming in. This really is Beethoven's true program music, although it exists without knowing the story as well. He writes to his publisher in July, "We have passed through a great deal of misery. I have brought into the world little that is connected, only here and there a fragment. The whole course of events has affected me, body and soul. What a disturbing wild life around me. Nothing but drums, cannons, men, misery of all sorts." And supposedly, while during this time, he met up a French general and he said, "If I were a general and knew as much about strategy as I do about counterpoint, I'd give you fellows something to think about." So I'm going to go back now and stop my share and let you watch some of me play this. Here we go. So as I mentioned, there's this in 3 movements, and although it's called Les Adieux because it was published with the French name, which was sort of the common thing, Beethoven hated that name. He wanted it to be called Lebewohl, which is a much more personal saying of goodbye. Adieu you can say to a whole countryside, a whole people. But I don't know if you can see on the first page there, under the first 3 notes, he actually writes Lebewohl, which is sort of the goodbye, and it sounds like, and that little motive becomes the basis for that whole movement. There's the second part where we hear the sort of running away of the carriages, and this movement of that really feels like the carriage is going away, and we hear the horn, which was the sound of the carriages getting ready. Then we have this incredible slow movement with these wonderful chords, these diminished sevenths that sound like this. Very dissonant, painful sounds that show the missing of the absence. And then the last movement, which he calls Die Wiedersehen, or the return, really the beginning sounds like kind of a puppy dog. Just running to greet the person as he comes in. It's just a wonderful depiction of a return. So here's the full Les Adieux Sonata, as it's called, Opus 81A. Sonata and all three movements. Again, we sort of consider that probably the end of his middle period, or right at the beginning of his late period. It still has that heroic drive. It still sort of makes sense structurally, like a lot of other later Beethoven pieces don't. But it has moments of sort of those silences and motives that are really just kind of fascinating, that show where he's going to head next. And we'll see that in the next couple pieces. All right, so let me move now to... Now, last class I did talk a little bit about his immortal beloved letters, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but as I mentioned, Beethoven was forever looking for a wife and never able to actually get her. We know that the immortal beloved letters, there are these letters that were discovered after Beethoven dies, that either he didn't mail or whoever he mailed them to gave him back to them so that he had them. We don't really know the answer to that. We also don't know exactly, we didn't know when they were written. They just had the date Monday, July 6th on it without a year. And the first biographer, Anton Schindler, for some reason determined that, without really telling people that he didn't know this for a fact, that the immortal beloved was Countess Giulietta Guicciardi, for whom he had written the Moonlight Sonata back in the beginning in 1800, and that they were written in 1806. But Monday was not July 6th in 1806, so that can't be. And further research has determined that they must have been written in 1812, after Beethoven had been to Prague with whoever this person was. They had a tryst together, some kind of time together, and then these letters were written afterwards as they decided whether they were going to get together again. And then we don't really know what happened. Some of the writing in it is really overpowering romantic stuff. He writes, "My angel, my all, my very self, can you change the fact that you are not wholly mine, I not wholly thine?" That seems to imply that she might be involved with another person. "Wherever I am, you are with me. Is not our love truly a heavenly structure, and also as firm as the vault of heaven?" And then in a later part of the letter, he said, "My thoughts go out to you, my immortal beloved, waiting to learn whether or not fate will hear us. Your love makes me at once the happiest and the unhappiest of men. At my age, I need a steady, quiet life. Can that be so in our connection?" That seems to imply that maybe he's wavering a little bit because he wants to create. "Be calm. Only by a calm consideration of our existence can we achieve our purpose to live together. Ever thine, ever mine, ever ours, Ludwig." Now, there are several different theories as to who this person was. The great Maynard Solomon, who wrote a wonderful kind of psychological book, a kind of Freudian analysis of Beethoven. He was actually the brother of my nursery school teacher back in Boston. So he's a great scholar. But he seemed to come to the conclusion, and a lot of people followed him, that the immortal beloved was this woman named Antony Brentano, who... and he sort of based it more on the fact that he knew that she was in Prague just before the letter was written, and that she may have been contemplating leaving her husband at the time. That seems to be a big we don't know that for a fact. The fact is, Beethoven was friends with Franz Brentano, her husband, and it seems unlikely that Beethoven would sort of fool around with somebody who he was friends with like that. So a lot of people are sort of moving away from this. She had been married since 1798. They had 6 children together, and in fact, Beethoven would later dedicate his Diabelli variations to Brentano, and then his Opus 109 Sonata, which I'll play next week, to her daughter, Maximiliane, who would take piano lessons with him. Brentano wrote beautifully about Beethoven, and once she said, "He is, as a human being, greater than he is as an artist, with soft heart and glowing soul, natural, simple, wise, with pure intentions." So a lot of American scholars go along with this. I am of the opinion, though, and I think I mentioned this last time, that it was really this woman, Josephine Dame, who was born Josephine Brunswick, came from a family, Teresa Brunswick, who also was a possibility as one of the immortal beloved. They had castles everywhere. She had begun piano lessons with Beethoven in 1799. had married this wealthy count much older than her. Then he dies, and we do know that Beethoven wrote passionate love letters to her after this count dies, from 1804 to 1806. I read some of those at the last class, and they sound a lot like the Immortal Beloved letters. They were not found until much after, sometime in the 20th century, these letters were discovered. And we know that the last letter was about 1809. At that point, we know that she ends up marrying another person. Baron von Stackelberg was his name, had 2 more children with him, but we know that that marriage was not a happy one. And there seems to be proof that she left him in 1812. And in fact, her diary in June of 1812 mentions an upcoming trip to Prague and no more entries during that summer. We also know that she has another child exactly 9 months after that meeting would have taken place in April of 1813. The name is Minona, which if you read backwards is anonyme or anonymous. And a lot of people have begun to think that maybe this could have been Beethoven's child. He may not even have known that he impregnated her. The Stackelberg came and sort of took her away and the child. She had a crazy life, ends up having another daughter with another tutor, and she would die in 1821, the year that he writes his amazing Opus 110 piano sonata, which seems to be a love letter to somebody. So I'm of the opinion it's her. We don't really know. There's one other possibility, which is going to be a fascinating one. If you saw the movie Immortal Beloved, with a great playing of Gary Oldman as Beethoven, the filmmaker, who was not a scholar, comes out with the crazy idea that the Immortal Beloved was actually Johanna Beethoven, his sister-in-law, who he tortured, which I'll talk about, for the rest of his life. When his brother dies, Karl, he takes away Johanna's child, calls this child his son, his name Karl. And in fact, some say that maybe it was his son, that they had actually had a tryst way before. I think that's pushing it, but it does make an interesting movie, and it may explain why he is so cruel to her, because maybe she turned him down. Anyways, I still go along with this. We do know, I forgot to mention that around this time, Beethoven begins to withdraw into himself as the things are falling apart. In 1810, he writes a letter to a friend. "I can only seek support in my own heart. There is none for me outside of it. Nothing but wounds have come to me from love and such kindred feelings. So be it then. For you, poor Beethoven, there is no happiness in the outer world. You must create it in yourself." So he starts thinking about his art as the only way to get happiness in the world. To another woman named Bettina von Arnim, he writes, "I don't have a single friend. I must live alone, but well I know that God is nearer to me than to others." And he really did sense that he was communing with God a lot of the times. "I associate with him without fear. I have always recognized and understood him, and I have no fear for my music. It can meet no evil fate. Those who understand it must become free from all the miseries that the others drag with them." And in his diary of 1816, he writes, "Live alone in your art, restricted though you be by your defective sense. This is still the only existence for you." And again, he's been going deaf since about 1800, but by this time it's almost complete, and he has to sort of give up piano playing shortly because he just can't even hear to be able to play. At this time, he also copies out these 3 ancient Egyptian inscriptions, and he keeps them framed and mounted in large print under glass on his work table. And there are 3 things. They say, "I am that which is. I am everything that is, that was, and that will be. No mortal man has lifted my veil." And finally, "He is of himself alone, and it is to this aloneness that all things owe their being." So really, he knew that he was great, no lack of confidence, but his life was a constant struggle to find happiness in the midst of all this. So I want to play now his Opus 90. This comes out in 1814 in the midst of a pretty depressing time in his life. Immortal Beloved seems to be over, but it's a beautiful, intimate, very kind of, it's a love piece, and especially the second movements people have described as kind of a love song between a husband and a wife. he dedicates this piece to Moritz von Lichnowsky, the younger brother of his former supporter, Karl Lichnowsky, who at the time happened to be romantically entangled with a much younger stage actress, who was, of course, beneath the level, the class of the family, but he ultimately decides to marry her against the family's wishes. Now, Anton Schindler, who was the first biographer and friend of Beethoven, not always the most reliable source. We know that he forged certain things, but he wrote that Beethoven had told Count Lichnowsky that the first movement of this piece was a struggle between the head and the heart. And there does seem to be this stuff going back and forth of a kind of more dramatic and this very light. So it does seem to be this kind of inner struggle, whether it was for Moritz's struggle or this struggle within about what love is. There's also a glorious moment at the development of this where we hear this little motive. He just plays the same notes over and over in different rhythms, as if there's two people having a conversation. Speeds it up, and it's just taking these three notes. That's what Beethoven does so well. Just take a simple motive and keep doing it over and over. And what's fascinating then is that the second movement, which sounds a lot like a Schubert song, it's so gentle. Is the exact opposite. While we had in the first movement, here we have this rising, the same three notes. One is in minor, and one goes to a major, all right? And so we have this first movement that seems like this interior dialogue between the loud and the soft. Should I do it? Should I not? I love her, but it's not smart. And that stretto voices coming together. And then, as some said, it's the second movement feels like a honeymoon with the lovers staring at each other with goo-goo eyes. And it's very repetitive. There's no drama in that movement, which is so surprising for Beethoven as he transforms from this tormented lover into a happy, contented husband. Hans von Bülow, the great pianist and conductor, described the difference between these movements as that between speech and song. What's also interesting about this piece is that he writes very long movement names in German. Unlike before, he stops using the Italian terms and the French terms, and he wants this German idea, and partly because it was a sort of patriotic thing, but also because the German language sort of has a more emotional side to it. So he writes, mit Lebhaftigkeit und durchaus mit Empfindung und Ausdruck, for the first movement, which is a long way of saying with feeling and expression all throughout. And then the second movement, nicht zu geschwind und sehr singbar vorgetragen, not too swiftly in a very singing manner. So he begins to use this, and that will set up the Hammerklavier Sonata, which we'll do at the end, which was just a German word for the forte piano, but he wanted to use that more Germanic language. All right, so I'm going to go back here now, if I can get out of here. And then we'll take a short little break after this if you have any questions. Here is the two movement, Opus 90, written in 1814. There's that little miniature that really almost doesn't sound like Beethoven. It's so tuneful, so relaxed. To me, it feels a lot more like Schubert if I was to play that. So we'll take a short little break here. Speaking of Schubert, that will be my next class coming up at the end of January, starting on January 20th for 4 weeks and Wednesday afternoon, also at 1 o'clock. I will do the life and times of the great Franz Schubert, some of his amazing sonatas, his impromptus, his fantasies, moments musicaux. He only lived for 31 years, and in fact, he may have gotten sick because he was the pallbearer at Beethoven's funeral, which we will talk about on Friday. He was one of the pallbearers in 1827, and within a year, Schubert himself had died at the age of 31. So lots of beautiful music coming up. Take a short little break now, maybe 3 minutes. What time is it now? 2 o'clock. Perfect. And I'll be back in about 3 minutes. I'm just going to get a little water here. If there's any questions, turn on your mics now. Let me see here. I got some chats here I'll look at. I know, it's amazing. The snow is coming down here. Somebody said how beautiful it was to watch the snow fall while I'm playing. I'm watching it too. It is so gorgeous. And it's so wonderful. Oh, yeah, Schubert's coming here. Yeah, and if everybody could turn their videos off. Again, Lily, if you didn't find out, if you go over to the videos, you should be able to just have your own there if you look above it. There's like a single line, a square, and 2 lines. You can get rid of everybody's video.
Yeah, I've been trying.
Oh, it didn't work?
Mm-mm.
I don't know why that doesn't work. On mine it does. Some of these Zoom things are
It
different.
usually does.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, but
Yeah.
please do keep your videos off because it can be disturbing. Um, and I don't know, is the picture still looking very good?
Picture looks great over here.
Okay, I can't tell because it looks okay from my end, but some people were saying that it looked a little fuzzy. And hopefully the sound is pretty good. But I'm definitely hooked into my Ethernet and should be pretty good. Let me see. Ellen has a question. That
When
one
is
was
the, sorry, when is
so
the Schubert class?
the Schubert class. It's all online now at amicimusic.org. You can look at it. It's going to start January 20th and run for 4 weeks after that. So like the 20th, the 27th, the last 2 weeks of January, the first 2 weeks of February. But I just put that on today on my website, so you can look at that if you want to join me for that class. It'll be another Zoom class like this, all Schubert and hopefully some songs if I can get a singer. So and all of you should have gotten a program sent to you for both today and tomorrow, so you can see what I'm playing, and Friday, I mean. That last one again was Sonata number 27 in E minor, Opus 90, written in 1814.
You have a program for this stuff, right?
Yeah.
This is coffee.
All right, so if there's any other questions, just let me know. We'll start again in about 2 minutes here. I would like to try to watch some of that movie with Paul Reese as Beethoven. Try to turn your mics off now if you're not going to be on here. I'm going to turn you guys off. Hold on a second here. There we go. I'm just turning people off. If you want to come on, just come on singly. But we will watch at the end of today. We might go a little over the part 3 of that BBC documentary, The Genius of Beethoven, which really shows the trauma of this time, which I'm going to get into now, as Beethoven fought to get custody of his nephew, which he really had no right doing, but he didn't like his sister-in-law. At least, maybe he loved her. Maybe it was too much stuff. We don't know the answer to that. I got to get ready for the Hammerklavier coming up, one of the craziest pieces ever written. All right, so let me just double check to make sure I got everything here. Wow, it is just beautiful with this snow coming. Hopefully you all are seeing some of it. It's the nicest snow I've seen in a long time. And again, today is Beethoven's birthday. There should be lots of opportunities to see Beethoven. I think there are some places that are doing 24-hour Beethoven. If you find like YouTube places, you can watch him all day long. Try to watch the Ninth Symphony if you can, the Fifth Symphony. The Missa Solemnis, which is a piece that is not often performed because it's so difficult, which I'll play a little bit of, an amazing mass. But just there's so much of Beethoven that is amazing that it's almost too much music. All right, so now around 1815, that last piece was in 1814, but 1815 is an interesting year, both politically and personally for Beethoven. This is when Napoleon is finally defeated, and the Congress of Vienna takes place in 1814 and 1815 to restore order to Europe. But in doing so, it's very much similar to our own time period, I think. After this moments of progressive bursts that we had 10 years ago, we had this period of reaction. There's this moment of looking inwards, and a lot of nationalism begins to take shape here. Very German culture in Spain. They only want the Spanish people there, and you see all the horrors of war that Goya paints at this time. But revolutionaries and progressive and liberals are all hunted down, imprisoned, and executed. And Vienna becomes this very censored area, secret police listening into all sorts of conversations. Beethoven didn't seem to care. He was constantly screaming and yelling his views about the dumb people running the government. But I think because he was Beethoven, he got away with it. A lot of his colleagues kept telling him, you got to keep it down. But as Beethoven once said, as long as the Viennese have their brown beer and little sausages, they will never revolt. And he was partly right about that. And the defeat of the hopes and the aspirations of the French Revolution, though they'd been already tainted by Robespierre and Napoleon, but the ideas were there of the enlightenment of liberty and equality and fraternity. There was some hope, and it seemed to just get squashed and suffocated by this era of reaction. And Beethoven's own creative drive dwindles. He doesn't nearly write as much over the next 10 years as he had poured out the 10 years before. And his music becomes much more introspective. He didn't really seem to care if there was an audience for a lot of his works, and you hear that in some of his piano sonatas. The Viennese taste headed towards something a lot more tuneful and soporific rather than something that would stimulate the mind. This is when Rossini became very popular, and the waltz era begins in Vienna with this cultivation of calm and comfort. Beethoven disparages this whole time period as frivolous and the sensuous spirit of our times. And there's a wonderful historian, Geoffrey Brune, who wrote about this period. He said, a spirit of disillusionment succeeded the high certainties of the age of reason and the expectations voiced in the revolutionary creed from that era. The philosophy of the Restoration was for many a thing of shreds and patches after the stark and glittering mirror world that the philosophes had held before the gaze of humanity. And the reversion to traditional pretension, petty policies, checks and balances and compromises, though it might mark a return to sanity and repose, still left behind a despairing conviction that humanity had failed itself. I think we might be at one of those inflection points now. We want a return to sanity, but we also don't want to lose the sense of something great within our people. And Beethoven was forever saying, we don't need to settle for this. I want to push you to mankind can strive for the greatest things in the world. And his piece is always about trying to find that ideal in mankind. But unfortunately, he didn't find the ideal with it himself in his relationship with his brother Carl and his nephew Carl and his sister-in-law Johanna, which takes up about the next 5 years of his life. He's busy going in and out of courtrooms trying to get a hold of his nephew. Caspar Carl was his middle brother, his closest brother, and he had married Johanna Rice in 1806 while she was already pregnant with their son Carl. And again, this is sort of what the movie The More Beloved says, that actually Beethoven was the father, and Carl married her to sort of get rid of that, the gossip about that. In any case, Beethoven once wrote, my brother's marriage was as much an indication of his immorality as of his folly. And they weren't very close for the next several years. But around 1813, 1814, they met up again while his brother is dying of consumption. And Ludwig begins to intervene, and he actually accuses Johanna of poisoning him. She said, my brother would be still alive if not for his wife. She is the queen of the night, using a magic flute motive there. It was a pretty violent marriage as far as we know. Carl apparently beat his son Carl and also once stabbed Johanna with a table knife. He charged her with stealing money from them. She in turn accused him of embezzling money from Ludwig because he helped as a secretary. The whole thing seemed to be a mess. And we know that Beethoven also opposed the marriage of his youngest brother, Nicholas, who ended up marrying his housekeeper in 1812. Beethoven sort of wanted these ideal women, and they were not them. But when Carl dies in November of 1815, there's this long struggle in which Beethoven tries to get custody. We know that in his will, November 14th, he wrote in his testament that Caspar Carl has said, along with my wife, I appoint my brother, Ludwig van Beethoven, co-guardian. But when Beethoven heard that he wrote this, he made him alter that sentence, and he just wrote, I appoint my brother Ludwig van Beethoven, guardian. But on the day that he's dying, Carl apparently wrote a codicil to his will, which he signed on the day saying, having learned that my brother, Ludwig van Beethoven, desires after my death to take wholly to himself my son Carl, and wholly to withdraw him from the supervision and training of his mother, inasmuch as the best of harmony does not exist between my brother and my wife, I have found it necessary to add to my will that I by no means desire that my son be taken away from his mother, but that he shall always, and so long as his future career permits, remain with his mother, to which end the guardianship of him is to be exercised by her as well as my brother. Now that would seem to be pretty crystal clear, but Beethoven had a lot more power as a man and as a famous person than his sister-in-law, and ultimately he wins custody of Carl right away, saying that that was not really Carl's will, his desire at the end there. And he sends him off to boarding school, at which point Carl keeps running back into his mother. Beethoven gets mad at him. There are reports of him beating Carl. It's just awful. You'll see this all in the movie. It was a psychological bullying that he did to Carl that caused ultimately Carl to try to kill himself, which we'll talk about in the next class. But also at this time, Beethoven makes his last performance as a pianist in January of 1815. He's really having more and more difficulty hearing. Ludwig Spohr, who was at that concert, said, on account of his deafness, there was scarcely anything left of the virtuosity of this artist, which had formerly been so greatly admired. In forte passages, the poor deaf man pounded on the keys until the strings jangled, and in the piano passages, he played so softly that whole groups of tones were omitted, so that the music was absolutely unintelligible. And that had to have been very difficult for Beethoven, who had grown up as this incredible pianist, not to be able to perform in public again. And it is at this time that during this whole struggle with trying to get custody of his nephew, that he gets sent to him a new piano by the maker Broadwood in England, which is bigger than anything that he had had up to then. It was 6 octaves. Our pianos today are 8 octaves, but up to then they had only been 5.5. So there were added notes, added power, and it was this piano that would inspire him then to now write his Hammerklavier Sonata in 1817, which is a work all unto its own. If I was to play the whole piece, it would be about 50 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes long. The third movement, which I'm going to play unto itself, is about at least 15 minutes. Some, if you play it really slowly, can drag it out to 25 minutes. And it really does have an incredible ability. About the last movement, which I will not play because it actually causes people to go crazy, is this fugue that is just utterly unintelligible at times, similar to the Grosse Fugue. In fact, there are some who say there's 2 pieces you really should not play by Beethoven, the Grosse Fugue and the 4th movement of the Hammerklavier. You'll hear a little bit in the movie because it's just an insane piece of music. But this whole piece, which we call Sonata number 29 in B-flat major, opus 106, but again, best known as Hammerklavier, which is simply this German word for the forte piano, this new kind of piano that was, he didn't want it played on a harpsichord. I don't know how you could play this piece on a harpsichord, but there were still harpsichords. And by saying Hammerklavier Sonata, he was saying, you cannot play this on a harpsichord. You would break every string if you tried it. It was dedicated to the Archduke Rudolph, like the first sonata I played. And in fact, early sketches show that Beethoven actually planned the opening melody as a birthday greeting addressed to the Archduke. Vivat, vivat, Rudolphus, like this. Vivat, vivat, Rudolphus. Vivat, vivat, Rudolphus. It sounds like a kind of rejoicing fanfare. And this is really the first of his late style pieces. And what makes it late is this. It's huge, it's this expansion of everything, so it becomes just this gigantic structure. But at the same time, there are so many little concentrated details. Everything comes down to this relationship of a third. Like a doorbell, ding dong. Like this whole piece, if you break it down, is that motive over and over and over. And these little moments of just detail. That's the third. That third sort of holds it's like the steel rods of the construction. The emotions in this piece range from just bombastic to the minute, and then the third movement especially, very bizarre key relationships, harmonies. People didn't understand this piece at all. Lots of counterpoint, especially in the fugue, that makes the music very dense. And the third movement, which I play, is one of the most beautiful movements, although it goes on forever. It's almost static music. It just sort of sits there for a while. But at the same time, there's this filigree in it that sounds a lot like Chopin. We'll hear later on. Chopin really enjoyed this piece, and we know that he must have listened to the third movement. Charles Rosen, the great pianist, called it a work of despair so extreme that it seems frozen with a grief struggling to find expression. It is a mausoleum of collective sorrow. That's a beautiful sentence. Paul Becker called it the apotheosis of pain, of that deep sorrow for which there is no remedy, and which finds expression not in passionate outpourings, but in the immeasurable stillness of utter woe. And Wilhelm Kempff, another pianist, said it was the most magnificent monologue that Beethoven ever wrote. And again, that fourth movement includes this maniacal, uncompromising fugue. One writer described it, trying to play it, as trying to juggle chainsaws while reciting Shakespeare. A great quote. And Martin Cooper, who wrote about all the sonatas, said, "This work concedes nothing to the listener. No attempt is made to capture his attention or hold his interest. Instead, the composer communes with himself or contemplates his vision of reality, thinking aloud and concerned only with the pure essence of his own thoughts and with the musical processes from which that thought itself is often indistinguishable." So I'm going to play now the first movement and then the third movement of this crazy work. And hopefully I will not blast your ears off. It is a loud piece at times, and I'm trying to make sure I don't overdo it. So here's the first and third movement of the Hammerklavier Sonata. crazy first movement, and here's this incredibly long, painful third movement. And again, sort of all of that stuff going on with Carl, with the world, comes together in this incredible movement. Well, that's quite a movement. Goes on forever and ever. All right, so I'm going to talk more about the Missa Solemnis next week. I just wanted to get to this movie because it just shows it. And at the end of the part we'll go to, he has just written this Missa Solemnis, and there's a wonderful quote I'll read next time about him sort of stomping around as he's writing this piece, which he begins writing right after the Hammer Clavier. So stick around. It'll be about a 20-minute movie. We might go a little bit late, 25 or so, and I'll be here afterwards to get questions if you have any. Again, this is it's called The Genius of Beethoven. Whoops, where is it now? Wrong piece. Here we are. Right when his brother has died.
Requiem aeternam, dona et lux perpetua, luceat ei, et fiescat pace. Anima Deus,
With the death of his brother, Beethoven's emotional life changed forever. The composer's final years were to be dominated by his battle with his sister-in-law Johanna for possession of his young nephew. At 45, his hearing deteriorating, he retreated into a more exclusively private world, which represented the one period of creative silence in his mature career. The astonishing body of work from Beethoven's last decade was still to come, works of unsurpassed vision and complexity, like the Ninth Symphony, the late string quartets, and the Missa Solemnis. But for the next 2 years, Europe's most famous and celebrated composer would produce almost no new music. The catastrophe of his deafness had already robbed him of his life as a performing musician. For the moment, his creative energy and passion, his faith and aspiration would all be devoted to his 9-year-old nephew, Karl van Beethoven.
The piano was as mute as he was deaf. And he was deaf to all reason but his own regarding his nephew.
But your brother's request was that you and Johanna should bring up the boy together.
No, she made my brother do that. When he was on his deathbed, Stefan. Morally unfit. Morally unfit to be a mother.
I think you're in no position.
What did you? Drunk? No, I will inspire my nephew with industry and virtue after my own example. No? There's nothing more sacred than the care of a child.
I couldn't help remembering the lonely little boy I'd known back in Bonn. Ludwig's mother did so little to protect him. And now he became absolutely possessed with the notion of becoming a father himself. There was something innocent, but also desperate about it. And when he took his case to court, well, Vienna's greatest composer against poor Johanna.
The Imperial and Royal Landrecht of the Empire of Austria confers sole guardianship of the minor son Karl upon his uncle, Herr Ludwig van Beethoven.
won the day, my boy.
Te Deum. Laudamus. It took him years to forgive me for not supporting him. But I knew that his love for Karl, and he really did love the boy, it would demand too much. Beethoven hadn't found happiness with an adult. And what chance did a little boy have of living up to the expectations of a man like Ludwig?
Chattering in class when you should be paying attention to your lessons? Neglecting your piano practice? What's achieved in life without diligence? Nothing. Nothing. What's the matter with you?
Oh, for God's sake, woman! Not now!
Why are you sad?
I make you ashamed. And I'm ashamed of myself.
I am going to rid you of your mother's poison.
Coffee now?
For God's sakes, woman, not now.
My precious boy. My trouser button.
I always felt he wanted to be not just a father to the boy, but his everything, his whole world. And for a while, this little family that he had created, this father and son, well, it was Ludwig's whole world.
All the creative zeal and uncompromising commitment of Beethoven the composer was now expressed in Beethoven the parent. There were no half measures. Nothing could soften his hostility to Karl's mother or temper his fanatical devotion to what he considered his moral duty as loving father to a young human spirit.
Sort this out.
Without that woman's influence, he'll be a better man.
We'll look at the laundry lists later.
He's happier now, isn't he? Huh? You've been out for 2 hours. Don't tell me you've been to school. I know you haven't been to school. You've been to see... You were seen! You haven't been in school. You've been to see your mother. Yes, you've been to see your mother. Don't lie! Don't lie to me! You're my son! You're my son! You're not her son! You're my son! You're my son! Mine! Karl? Karl? Oh, Karl. Oh, my God.
Unable to recognize boundaries or the limits of reasonable behavior, Beethoven was on the edge of emotional breakdown. Such a crisis might reasonably precipitate disintegration, but in Beethoven's case, extreme crisis led to quantum creative leaps. 15 years earlier, the Eroica Symphony had emerged from the devastation of his deafness, and now, with a level of personal despair even higher than that, Beethoven broke the silence of the last 2 years with the greatest of all his piano sonatas, the Hammerklavier. This is a monster of a piece, using every inch of the keyboard and wresting every bit of expressive possibility out of the instrument. It makes technical demands far beyond anything pianists had encountered before. The forte piano, pointedly given its German name, Hammerklavier, is no longer just an expressive tool, but an almost machine-like challenge to the human performer. There's a rigorous intellect at work here, a new sense of both integration and creative freedom, hallmarks of Beethoven's late style. And from this astonishingly assured and ambitious work, it becomes clear that Beethoven's period of low production wasn't in any way a creative slowdown. In fact, while dealing with the intense moral and practical demands of fatherhood, Beethoven was concluding a spectacular creative metamorphosis. From now on, the challenges that he set himself, his musical and ideological aspirations, far surpassed anything of his earlier years.
He was in despair when Karl ran away. I didn't think things could get any worse. They did. Johanna took him back to court.
Karl?
Why did you run away from your uncle? Why? Has your uncle ever mistreated you?
He has often had to punish me, and I've always deserved it.
What's interesting here, I think, is that the more Beethoven confronts the law, the more his music becomes about rules, how to twist them, bend them, break them. The last movement of the Hammerklavier Sonata is really a huge fugue, the most rule-bound of all compositional forms, literally a musical straitjacket. And this fugue is one of the most ambitious and complicated ever written. A fugue is built from a single theme, and here Beethoven's theme is so complicated that it is, in itself, a challenge to any composer. Its big leap, trill, and series of helter-skelter notes make it very distinctive, so that every time this theme appears, it's easy to recognize. As the piece develops, Beethoven uses every conceivable fugal device, literally every trick in the book. He more than lives up to his great model, J.S. Bach. What makes this fugue so extraordinary is the way Beethoven contrasts the strict discipline of the form with an excessive, almost anarchic sense of freedom. Again, there are no borders, no limits. Anything might happen.
Then when I heard she had taken a secret lover and was displaying herself on immodest dance floors throughout Vienna, my only concern was for my little boy's soul.
I was advised that Beethoven is greatly neglecting my son's physical and moral upbringing.
In this fugue, the sheer intellectual display is astonishing. He creates more rules than are necessary, deliberately placing obstacles and challenges in his own path. At one point, he even turns his theme backwards.
It is no secret that my brother-in-law is deaf. My son cannot even speak to him.
I have often asked him if he's fond of his mother, and he's always responded in the negative.
He fragments and disrupts it to the point that it almost disintegrates, but the inexorable thrust of fugue holds it together. Constantly disrupting and fragmenting the rules, Beethoven is creating a logic of disintegration rather than integration, which makes the music more and more compulsive. You can hear him trying to pull everything together and succeeding.
I've nothing to gain except for recognizing in myself the man who gave my son a better human nature.
Herr Ludwig van Beethoven is to be appointed guardian of the said minor Carl van Beethoven, to the complete exclusion of the mother.
So, he finally had the boy. And Johanna went on to have another baby, Ludovica. There was some question over who the father was, and Ludwig felt that proved his case against her once and for all. Carl seemed not to miss her anymore after the baby was born. And he was soon sent back to boarding school.
God sees into our hearts and our conscience. He knows that I perform all of the duties required of me by humanity, God, and nature.
Beethoven was religious inwardly. He didn't attend church. His theories weren't based on any church dogmas or ritual. They were revealed to him by nature herself. He recognized God in the world, and the world in God.
From what we can see of God's work, we can conclude that he is present in every part of space.
Ask his girl to deal with this, will you? So, these powders 6 times daily and 6 bowls of the tea. If the powders don't work, we'll try another enema.
One day this will be the end of me.
Oh, come on. We'll put that day off for a long time yet.
It's a bad man who doesn't know how to die. I've known that since I was a boy of 15. My only regret is that I've done so little for art. Ludwig, as far as all that's concerned, forgive me, but you could leave us today. I do have some very different things in mind.
All right, I think we'll stop there. We'll start with the Missa Solemnis on Friday, and then we'll have to kill off Beethoven as well. If there's any questions, let me know now, and otherwise, hopefully the same link will happen on Friday, and I'll see you all a little before 1 o'clock.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Bye-bye.
Great question.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Stay safe.
You too. Bye, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Erwin.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Thank
everybody.
you, Jane.
All right, see you Friday.
I wish this went on for 3 more hours.
I might die if I did that. Take care.